Jon Snow stood at the edge of the practice yard, the wind cutting across his cheeks, sharp as any blade Ser Roderick had ever pressed into his hand. He was supposed to leave with his uncle Benjen in the morning, bound for the Wall, a path many men said was an honor and a curse at once. The Night's Watch, a life in service and darkness, a sacrifice, and yet the thought that had been gnawing at him all these past weeks would not relent. Why should I take the black now, when Winterfell might still be mine to defend? He remembered the day he had first arrived at Winterfell, clinging to his father's cloak. He had not even been old enough to hold a sword, but something about the gray walls, the massive towers, and the warm great hall had made him feel like he was home, as if the granite and ancient timbers somehow whispered, "You belong here." In the years that followed, he had grown among the Starks as a brother to Robb, Bran, Rickon, and the girls, but always with that subtle wedge of difference, Bastard Snow. Even so, he'd felt more kinship to the old gods in the Weirwood Grove than to any vow that would exile him to a blighted stretch of frozen wall. Now Ned Stark was gone, beheaded in King's Landing for treason that no one in Winterfell truly believed he had committed. Robb had marched south, calling loyal banners, determined to free their father or avenge him. But everything had happened too quickly. There was a letter, a quiet conversation with Maester Luwin, and then the news had spread in hushed tones. Lord Eddard was dead. Jon's father, his true father in all but blood, was gone. Catelyn Tully's grief had turned to steel in her eyes. Robb had become a king in the north in all but formal coronation, forging alliances in the Riverlands, placing himself in direct opposition to the Iron Throne. And in the midst of it all, Jon was being sent north, away from the battles, away from the war, away from any claim or right. The Black, the oath, the final severance from any hope that he might stand tall in the halls where he'd grown up and say, "This is my home, too." He felt Ghost's hot breath at his side, the dire wolf as white as fresh-fallen snow, pressing closer as though sensing his master's turmoil. Jon laid a hand on the beast's neck, drawing comfort from the solidity of that living presence. Over the last few weeks, Ghost had grown silent and watchful, more than ever. Jon had even begun to suspect the wolf might sense some strange path lying ahead, an alternate road Jon was afraid to consider, until now. Night was settling over Winterfell. The courtyard was empty, save for a handful of guards patrolling the walls. Grey Wind, Robb's direwolf, had gone south with his master. Shaggy Dog and Summer remained with Rickon and Bran, but they were locked in the Great Keep, for the Boy Lords were full of confusion and nightmares since their father's death. Only Ghost prowled the yard beside Jon, and for a moment, as twilight bled across the sky, Jon could almost believe he was the sole defender of the ancient castle. A hush settled, and in that breath of silence, a decision was born within him. He would not go to the Wall. He stood there for some time, torn between fear and a sudden fierce longing for the place he called home. Then, surprising even himself, he turned from the training grounds and made his way to his father's solar. No, not his father's anymore. It was vacant now, though Maester Luwin sometimes used it for reading letters. Jon pushed open the heavy door, feeling the cold iron handle beneath his hand. The room smelled of dust and old parchment. The hearth was dark. In a corner rested the table and chairs where Ned Stark had once sat with his bannermen, awarding justice and forging alliances. Upon that table lay a map of the north, corners weighted down by small stones. The entire region, from the neck to the Shadow Tower, was etched there. Winterfell sat at the center, a proud fortress, a circle carved from oak and raised edges of black ink. Jon's gaze settled on it, heart pounding in his ears. "Winterfell is mine." The words came unbidden. He did not truly believe them. He was Ned Stark's bastard, not his heir. But Robb was gone. Bran and Rickon still children. Sansa and Arya were captives somewhere in the south, or so the rumors said. Who would hold the castle? Who would keep the north safe while the rightful heir fought in the wars to come? As the wind rattled the shutters, Jon placed his palms on the map, over the sigil of the direwolf. If he left for the Wall, the castle would remain vulnerable. There were guards and loyal men, of course, but also tensions. The Ironborn lurked, ever opportunistic. The Boltons, the Karstarks, the Umbers, any of them might test the fortress if it seemed weak. But if Jon declared himself protector of Winterfell until Robb returned, who would dare dislodge him? He closed his eyes and remembered his father's voice. Duty is as heavy as a mountain, yet it cannot be set aside for love or longing. But this was duty in its own way. No one else would stand guard here, not with Robb so far away. Let me hold the north until my brother comes home. The thought lit a spark in him, a small flame of purpose that flared despite his fear. He left the solar without lighting a single candle, picking his way through dark corridors lit only by the pale glow of moonlight. In the great hall, a few men-at-arms dozed by the fire. Jon passed them without a word, climbing the stairs toward the lone place in Winterfell where he might find the final push of courage to shape his decision. The crypts beneath the castle. At the entrance to those dark halls, the chill in the air deepened. A single torch sputtered in an iron sconce, hardly enough to cast more than a flickering gloom. The stone steps spiraled downward, and a smell of dust and earth rose to greet him. Each step felt heavier than the last as he descended among the ancient kings and lords of House Stark. Their statues lined the passages, each carved with the face of the lord who lay entombed beneath. Jon's footsteps echoed in that solemn hush. The presence of centuries of Starks pressed in around him, silent as the grave itself. Ned Stark's tomb was prepared but not yet sealed. His father's bones had not returned from King's Landing. There had been no time for that, not yet. The coffin lay empty, the statue uncompleted. Even so, Jon could barely bear to look upon the chiseled face. The stonemasons had tried to carve Ned's likeness, capturing his quiet dignity, his stern gaze, but it was imperfect. Still, it tugged at Jon's heart. He stepped toward it, knelt upon the floor, and felt the weight of tears pressing behind his eyes. "I failed you," Jon whispered, though he was not entirely sure in what way. Maybe because he was too slow. Maybe because he had not convinced his father to run. Maybe because he was leaving for the wall without questioning if that was truly his destiny. "I failed you by not standing at your side when they accused you of treason. I wasn't even there." His throat tightened, and his voice cracked. I am sorry." He bowed his head, letting the torchlight flicker across him and the cold stone. Then he heard a soft scrape behind him. "Jon," came a voice. He turned to see Maester Luwin, hooded in his gray robes, a small lamp in hand. The old man looked at him with kind, concerned eyes. "It's late, my boy. You leave at dawn. You should be resting." Jon drew a slow breath, stood, and leveled his gaze at the Maester. "I'm not leaving, Maester. I can't. My father is dead, and Robb is gone. Bran and Rickon are too young. Someone must protect Winterfell." Maester Luwin's face darkened, though his voice remained gentle. "I understand how you feel, Jon, but the Night's Watch was Lord Eddard's wish for you." Robb and Lady Stark agreed. "They are not here now," Jon said, surprising himself with the force of his words. Father made that arrangement before any of this happened. He never knew that the Iron Throne would kill him. He never foresaw war like this, at least not so soon. The North needs a Stark in Winterfell, and if Robb is to be king in the North, he needs me here to keep our lands secure. Maester Luwin's eyes flickered in uncertainty. "But you are not a Stark, Jon. You are a Snow." "Yes, I know. But Ned Stark's blood runs in my veins, and I have a duty to my siblings. My father, if he had known everything that would come to pass, would never have cast me away to the wall. You must see that." The old man's gaze traveled to the empty coffin, and his shoulders sagged. "I see only heartbreak brewing," he said quietly. "But if you are determined, I cannot force you onto a horse. It will cause a rift with Lady Catelyn." Jon forced down the surge of doubt that rose at those words. He had spent a lifetime dancing around Lady Stark's hostility, but this time, for better or worse, he had to stand his ground. "I will do what's right for Winterfell," he said. "The North is in danger, and I will not abandon it." Maester Luwin sighed, pressing the lamp to his chest as if trying to cradle its warmth. "Then the first question is how you mean to claim it," Words alone will not suffice. Not with your father's widow in Riverrun and your brother in the field. People might see your hold on this castle as an act of usurpation. Jon felt cold sweat bead at his brow. It isn't usurpation if I declare that I am only a steward of Winterfell in Robb's absence, that I will defend it until he returns. That is not a thing commonly done, the Maester warned. The great houses are not known to cede authority to bastards, even in times of war. You may find yourself labeled a rebel by some. The lords might not flock to your banner. They will if they care for Ned Stark's memory, Jon said. It was a bold claim, one he was not entirely certain of, but he clung to it like a shipwrecked man clutching driftwood. I will write to Robb in the morning, explaining my decision. I can only hope he sees reason. With that, Jon turned back to the empty tomb, silent and heavy-hearted. The Maester left him to his vigil, footfalls echoing softly as they faded away. Standing alone with the statue of Eddard Stark, Jon felt the pressing finality of his choice, and for once he did not waver. Before dawn, Jon packed his belongings, yet not in readiness for a journey north. Instead, he donned a leather jerkin bearing the direwolf sigil that had once been Robb's spare. It felt odd to wear House Stark's crest openly, but it felt just as natural, as if he was claiming a piece of his birthright for the first time. He strapped Longclaw to his hip. The Valyrian steel sword Lord Commander Mormont had meant to gift him upon taking the Black. Perhaps Mormont would never forgive him for breaking his oath before it was even made. But the blade had been given in gratitude for saving his life, not because of Jon's vow. In the courtyard, he found Uncle Benjen waiting alongside 2 horses laden for the journey. Benjen Stark frowned at Jon's attire, and his gray eyes seemed to darken. Ghost stood at Jon's side, hackles slightly raised, as if anticipating confrontation. Jon, Benjen began quietly. You're not ready? I'm not going, Uncle, Jon said, forcing himself to meet Benjen's gaze. I can't take the Black, not when Winterfell is left behind like this. My father is dead, Robb and Lady Stark are gone, and the younger Starks need someone here. Benjen's mouth tightened. You were eager enough before. This is what your father wanted for you. Do you mean to spit on his memory? Jon's heart pounded. I hope I honor him, not defy him. Everything has changed. Father is gone, executed by the Lannisters, by the Iron Throne. The North is in open rebellion. Winterfell needs a Stark. Or the closest to one. Benjen looked from Jon to the men of Winterfell who were beginning to gather around, drawn by the tension in the air. The older Stark's voice lowered. I can't force you to come with me, but know that this decision won't be forgotten. The Night's Watch is an ancient order. Breaking faith with it. I haven't taken any vows, Jon interrupted. I haven't sworn anything yet. I'm not deserting, Uncle. I'm simply refusing to go. Benjen's lips drew into a grim line, but he did not strike Jon or call him Oathbreaker. Perhaps there was still some corner of his heart that understood. Then do what you must, he said finally. But do not expect the Watch to open its gates for you in the future if you regret this choice. Jon swallowed the knot in his throat, nodded, and watched in silence as Benjen swung into the saddle. The older man's horse stamped the cold ground. Then, without another word, Benjen urged the steed into a trot and rode out of Winterfell's gates. Several black-clad men followed, shooting Jon uncertain or angry glances. Jon stood, shoulders squared, not letting any sign of fear show on his face. The gates closed behind them with a heavy thud that reverberated through his bones. He turned to face a half-circle of onlookers, guards, serving men, and a few curious stable boys. Their expressions ranged from surprise to confusion. Jon swallowed and raised his voice, stilted at first, but growing steadier as he spoke. My friends, he began, the Night's Watch and I have parted ways. I remain in Winterfell. We are at war, and I will not let our home stand unguarded. As Ned Stark's son, I mean to hold the castle until Robb Stark returns. I ask for your loyalty and aid in defending Winterfell against any threat. A hush fell. Then, to Jon's relief, some among the guard, Old men who had served Eddard Stark all their lives stepped forward and nodded. It was no rousing cheer, but it was acceptance, a first step. Jon felt a tremor of relief. He was not alone. That day, Jon explored every corner of the castle with a new eye. The library tower, the kitchens, the godswood, the battlements. He took stock of their food stores, the state of the armory, the number of archers on watch. Maester Luwin followed him from place to place, scribbling details on a wax tablet. They learned that, with a stretch of rationing, the fortress could support its current population through a long winter, but not if an influx of refugees arrived. Arms were decent but needed better organization. Routines had slipped since Ned Stark departed for King's Landing. The discipline Robb had instilled when he briefly ruled was fading in the face of uncertainty. Bran and Rickon were in the Great Keep, looked after by the wildling woman Osha, Hodder, and a handful of old servants. Bran, pale-faced and still adjusting to the crippling fall that had nearly taken his life months ago, watched Jon with wide eyes as Jon knelt beside his wheelchair. "Are you going to be the Lord now?" Bran asked softly, small hands clutching his chair's arms as if bracing for another fall. Jon mustered a faint smile, brushing a hand over Bran's short brown hair. "Only until Robb returns, and then I'll step aside for him. But I promise I'll do everything I can to keep you and Rickon safe." Rickon, not quite 4, peered at Jon from behind a table. His direwolf, shaggy dog, snarled whenever anyone drew too close. The boy looked lost, tears dried on his cheeks. "I want father," he said. Jon's chest constricted at the sorrow in that young voice. "So do I," Jon whispered, but there was nothing else to say that would soothe him. Instead, he offered a small wooden figure, a carved direwolf, that he had once kept among his meager possessions. Rickon accepted it, still uncertain, but at least he stopped retreating as Jon approached. The day passed in a blur of new duties. Jon received a raven from Robb that very evening, though it had been sent days before. Written in a firm but hurried scrawl, it spoke of battles in the Riverlands, alliances with the Freys, the victory at Whispering Wood, the capture of Jaime Lannister. Jon's hands shook as he read the lines describing how Robb had laid a cunning trap for the Kingslayer. There was no mention of Jon. Robb had penned the letter before he knew that Ned's death would reshape Jon's destiny. How different the world seemed in so short a time. Jon asked Maester Luwin to send a swift reply. "Robb, I write to you with the heaviest heart. I have refused the call of the Night's Watch. In Father's absence, and yours, I have taken on the protection of Winterfell. I do this not to betray you, but to ensure that the seat of our house remains in Stark hands. I stand as steward and guardian only. I will hold it until you return. Bran and Rickon are safe. Send word when you can, and know that I pray for your victories. Your brother always, Jon Snow." He pressed his seal upon it with the direwolf sigil that once belonged to his father's signet ring, an old wax impression kept among the Maester's tools for official letters. He worried how Robb would interpret it, how Catelyn might react, but the letter was sent nonetheless. If Robb objected, he would make his will known. For now, Jon could only keep moving forward. In the weeks that followed, Jon set about creating a sense of stability in Winterfell. He ordered the gates to remain closed at night. The watch doubled. The men who might once have dismissed him as a bastard found themselves surprised at his competence. He had not spent his youth idle. Under Ser Roderick's instruction, he had learned command and discipline. Perhaps he was not Ned Stark, but his voice held a calm resolve that gradually won over many of the old guards. Of course, not all were pleased. 3 days after Benjen departed, a small group of men loyal to Lady Catelyn approached Jon in the courtyard, eyes stern. Their spokesman was Harwin, son of Hullen, once Ned Stark's stablemaster. He bowed his head respectfully, but his expression was troubled. "My lord," he began, stumbling a bit over the title. "We have received word from Riverrun. There's confusion about your role here. Some say you set yourself up as Lord of Winterfell. Others claim you refused the oath because you intend to claim the North for yourself." Jon let the men gather around him. He could sense their tension, and Ghost, at his side, let out a low growl. Jon put a hand on Ghost's neck to calm him. "I have no intention of challenging Robb," Jon said, loud enough for all to hear. "He is Ned Stark's true heir. The day he steps through that gate, I will bend the knee if that is what it takes to show my loyalty, though I hope he knows he has it already. Until then, I will defend Winterfell as best I can." Harwin searched Jon's face, found only sincerity there. At length he nodded, shoulders relaxing. "Then I'll do my part as well. We all will. Lady Catelyn would not want the castle left abandoned. Not truly." Jon offered his hand, and Harwin clasped it, sealing a silent pact of understanding. Tension eased, though not entirely. There would still be murmurs in dark corners, resentments unvoiced. Yet each day, Jon lived and breathed for Winterfell, and his actions spoke more powerfully than any vow of loyalty. He visited the kitchens, sat with the small folk to hear their complaints, heard disputes among the guards. Each night, he walked the walls with Ghost, scanning the snowy horizon, remembering how his father used to do the same. Then came the ravens, two in quick succession. One from the south, detailing the chaos of war. The other from the Iron Islands, sealed with a kraken. Jon read both and felt an unsteady lurch in his gut. Balon Greyjoy was raising sails again, talking of independence. There were rumors the Ironborn planned to harry the coastlines of the north, to raid deep if the fortress was left vulnerable. Jon called Ser Roderick Castle into the great hall one frosty morning. The old knight, mustached and gray-haired, looked more gaunt than Jon remembered. Winter was pressing closer, and the weight of wars on all sides was a crushing thing. "Ser Roderick," Jon said, "you are master at arms. You trained me and Robb, and you guarded the castle with father. Tell me truthfully, are we prepared if the Ironborn attack the Stony Shore or Torren Square?" Ser Roderick folded his arms over his chest. "Lord Stark," he began, then corrected himself at Jon's glance. "Jon, we have men, but not enough to scatter all over the north. Most marched south with Robb or joined him at the Twins. Winterfell's garrison is but a fraction of what it was. We must send word to our bannermen," Jon said, trying to recall all he had learned about the region. "The Manderlys, the Boltons, the Serwins, the Tallhearts, the Glovers, if they have men they can spare, they must help us guard the coast. Otherwise, the Ironborn will strike at our weakest points." Ser Roderick rubbed his chin. "Some might respond, but many have already gone to join Robb's host. Worse, I hear rumors that Roose Bolton wages the war in his own way. He is cunning, that one. But I suppose we have no choice. We shall muster what we can." Jon frowned. It was not enough to rely on uncertain bannermen who might be embroiled in the war. He would need to call out a levy under his own authority, an authority many questioned. "Ser Roderick," he said, "send out riders to all houses that remain. Tell them I call on their fealty in the name of Eddard and Robb Stark. We can't stand idle." Thus began a flurry of missives and the slow trickle of reinforcements. Scores, not hundreds, yet it was something. Men arrived wearing simple surcoats, bearing the arms of lesser houses. Jon greeted each group in the courtyard, offering them the hospitality of Winterfell. Some eyed him warily. Some spat the word bastard under their breath. But a surprising number found themselves impressed by his composure, perhaps reminded of Ned Stark, who had always borne himself with quiet resolve. The weeks turned into a month. Snow fell early that year. The courtyard was layered in pale drifts, the sky often thick with clouds. Winter was on the horizon, creeping in. Every day, Jon made the rounds of his realm, what little realm it was. He saw that the stables were stocked with feed, that the guards were well supplied with winter clothing. He took counsel with Ser Roderick and Maester Luwin, discussed strategy for repelling raiders, and oversaw archery practice in the yard. By day's end, he often found himself exhausted, but he could not rest. In the quiet hours of the night, he wrote in a small journal, penning his thoughts, his fears. Once, in a moment of stark loneliness, he wrote, "I am no lord, no true Stark, yet they look to me. I fear I will fail them all." He put the quill down then, stared at the trembling words. That was the first time he admitted such terror to himself, though he had felt it in every breath since refusing the black. It was only Ghost's warm presence at his feet that kept him from despair. Then, at last, a new raven came from Robb. The words were scrawled in a harsh, urgent hand. "Jon, word has reached me of your refusal of the Night's Watch. I wish things were different, but you are correct that we need a Stark in Winterfell. I had not realized how little strength remained there. I do not begrudge you your choice. Father would want you to protect our people. When this war is won, I shall return, and you will be the first I embrace. Keep Bran and Rickon safe. Beware of Theon Greyjoy. I have sent him to treat with his father on our behalf, but I do not fully trust him. The Greyjoys are an unpredictable house. The next time you write, tell me if you have enough men. I can spare little from my host, but I will send you what help I can, once victory is secured. Robb Stark, King in the North." Jon exhaled in relief, reading the lines again. No condemnation, no renunciation, merely acceptance and a warning about Theon. That was well enough. Catelyn might scorn Jon's new role, but if Robb recognized him, then many others would follow suit. It felt as though a weight slipped from his shoulders, though another soon took its place. The war was far from won. Life assumed a new rhythm. The nights grew colder. Early snows turned the fields around Winterfell white. Harvests were brought in from surrounding villages, and Jon oversaw their distribution so that no one starved. He visited Bran daily, discussing the boys' increasingly vivid dreams. Bran spoke of a three-eyed crow and deep crypts that called to him. Jon didn't know how to comfort him. Some nights Rickon howled in his sleep. The children felt the absence of their mother and older brother as a raw wound. Maester Luwin, for his part, offered counsel and gentle corrections to Jon's inexperience. Ser Rodrik handled the training of new recruits. Slowly, a sense of purpose settled over the castle. Yet rumors abounded of Lannister armies still prowling the riverlands. Tywin Lannister commanded a vast force that might strike north at any time if the war turned. And there was the Ironborn threat. Messages arrived telling of raids along the coasts, small at first, but brutal. One letter from a minor lord near the rills cried out for more men, describing how raiders had taken villagers, burned fishing boats, and vanished. Jon sent who he could, but that left Winterfell further weakened. He often spent sleepless nights pacing the battlements. Through it all, Ghost stayed at his side, silent and vigilant. Jon felt a strange connection to his direwolf growing stronger by the day, as if they shared not just an unspoken bond but glimpses of each other's spirits. In his dreams, Jon sometimes saw through Ghost's eyes, wandering the dark forests, sniffing out unseen threats. He would wake with the taste of blood in his mouth, fear pounding in his chest. The old gods are watching, he told himself, though whether that comforted or frightened him, he could not say. One dawn, a messenger arrived from Torren Square, near collapse from exhaustion. He was brought to Jon in the great hall, where a small fire crackled, vainly trying to push back the chill. The man wore a battered surcoat and clutched a hastily sealed scroll. "My lord," he gasped, knees trembling. Jon rushed to steady him, guiding him to a bench by the hearth. "My lord," the man repeated, eyes wild. "The Ironborn, they came in the night. Lord Tallheart fights them still, but they're many. Some ships along the coast. They burned the harbor. Others pressed inland." Jon's heart pounded. "Winterfell will send relief immediately," he said, summoning Ser Rodrik with a gesture. "Ser, gather any men we can spare, 200, 300 if possible." He turned back to the messenger. "How many did you see? Who leads them?" The man swallowed hard. It was Theon Greyjoy, my lord, flying his father's banner. We thought he was an ally, but he turned on us." Jon felt the blood drain from his face. Theon. He recalled Robb's warning. He had once considered Theon almost a brother, albeit one with a swaggering arrogance. Theon had grown up in Winterfell as a hostage, a ward, but there had been times he and Jon had shared laughter, archery contests. Now he had turned traitor, leading Ironborn raiders against the north. Ser Rodrik hurried away to muster the men. Jon knelt by the messenger, offering him a cup of water. "Rest here," Jon said. "You've done your duty." After the messenger had sipped, coughed, and finally settled, Jon moved aside. He pressed a palm against the cold stone wall, trying to contain the surge of betrayal and fury that coursed through him. Theon had turned, and if the Ironborn were already at Torren Square, Winterfell might be next, especially if Theon believed the castle lightly held. Jon called Maester Luwin to his side. "Send a raven to Robb. Let him know Theon Greyjoy has attacked. Beg him for reinforcements if he can spare them. Otherwise, we stand alone." The next hours passed in a frenzy. Jon strapped on his armor, stiff boiled leather, newly fitted steel vambraces, a wolf's head helm. He and Ser Rodrik led 300 men out of Winterfell's gates, determined to lift the siege at Torren Square. Jon left the castle under the command of a trusted sergeant and Maester Luwin. Bran and Rickon were distraught, but Jon knelt before them both, promising he would return. Rickon clung to his leg, tears streaming, while Bran merely stared, face pale as milk. Outside, the northern roads were muddy with half-frozen slush, and the wind bit at their exposed skin. But the men pressed on, determined to reach Lord Tallheart before the Ironborn could overrun the square. Ghost loped ahead, scouting, always returning to Jon's side with ears perked. The journey took days, each mile filled with tension. On the third evening, they encountered a family fleeing their farm, battered and terrified, confirming that the raiders were indeed near. At last, they arrived near Torren Square at dusk. The fortress was under siege. Jon's heart twisted at the sight. Smoke curled upward from damaged outbuildings. The gates bore deep scars, though they still held. A scattering of Ironborn encampments ringed the castle, their torches flickering in the gloom. From behind the walls, the Tallheart banner fluttered feebly. Under the cover of darkness, Jon and Ser Rodrik positioned their men. They had the advantage of surprise, though fewer numbers than they would like. Jon could see the Ironborn in the flickering glow, raucous in their pillaging. Some were drunk, overconfident. He prayed that complacency would be their downfall. When the moon rose bright and pale, Jon gave the signal. Horns sounded across the field. The Northmen charged. Jon spurred his horse forward, Longclaw in hand. Ghost bounded at his side, a white streak in the night. The Ironborn reeled in confusion. For a moment, it seemed as though the surprise would overwhelm them. Men shouted, weapons clashed, and the tang of blood stung Jon's nostrils. He cut through a reaver, the Valyrian steel slicing armor as if it were cloth. Then a second came at him, axe raised. Jon twisted in the saddle, blocked with Longclaw, nearly lost his grip, but managed to drive his blade into the raider's shoulder. The Ironborn fell with a howl. All around him, Ser Rodrik's men fought fiercely, spurred by hatred of these sea raiders who dared to ravage their lands. But the Ironborn were not easily cowed. Some among them rallied quickly, and Jon realized with a shock that Theon Greyjoy stood at the heart of their command. He wore black leather, emblazoned with the golden kraken. His hair was damp with sweat. By torchlight, Jon glimpsed a twisted grin on Theon's face, though whether it was excitement or fear, Jon could not be sure. "Jon!" Theon shouted, voice cutting through the din. "Jon Snow, you're a long way from the wall. Come to greet me?" Jon snarled, dismounting in one swift motion. He advanced, weapon raised, and Ghost let out a growl that vibrated in Jon's chest. "Traitor!" Jon spat. Theon circled, iron-tipped spear in hand. "You know nothing of it," he said. "Robb wouldn't grant me what was rightfully mine. My father demanded I prove my worth. The North is ripe for the taking, Jon." Men crashed around them, locked in deadly combat, but for that moment, it was as if Jon and Theon stood alone. Jon remembered the hunts they had gone on together, the jokes they'd shared by Winterfell's hearth. This man before him bore a grin that could have passed for that old Theon's, but the eyes were harder, emptier. "You grew up in Winterfell," Jon said, voice low. You swore fealty to Robb. How can you do this? It was never my home, Theon snapped. He lunged, spear tip whistling through the air. Jon barely dodged, raising Longclaw to parry. Steel sparked against steel. Theon was agile, more used to archery, but desperation lent him strength. He thrust again, forcing Jon back. Then Ghost lunged from the side, snapping at Theon's leg. Theon jerked away, cursing, whirling the spear to keep the direwolf at bay. Jon pressed the advantage, darting in with a slash. Theon blocked with his spear's shaft. The impact jarred them both. Theon kicked out, catching Jon in the side. Jon staggered, air exploding from his lungs. Stars danced in his vision, but he kept his grip on Longclaw. Gritting his teeth, he ducked under the next thrust, whirled, and brought the sword around with all his might. Theon barely managed to raise the spear in time, but the Valyrian steel sheared through wood and bit into Theon's arm. He let out a pained cry, dropping the ruined spear. Jon kicked Theon's chest, sending him sprawling into the mud. Ghost snarled, ready to rip out Theon's throat, but Jon called him off with a stern command. Panting, he held Longclaw to Theon's neck. "You were never family," Jon said, eyes burning with anger and sorrow both. "But I thought you were a friend." Theon spat muddy blood, trembling. "You think you're a Stark? You're no better than me. A stray dog sniffing after the scraps of a great house." Men converged, some of Jon's, some Ironborn. Theon's raiders, seeing their leader at sword point, faltered. Some dropped their weapons while others fought to the death. Ser Roderick's men pressed the advantage. Soon, the square was clear, and Torren Square's gates opened to let the Tallheart soldiers surge out, finishing off the last of the Reavers. Lord Tallheart himself, wounded but alive, embraced Ser Roderick with weary relief. Jon kept Longclaw pressed to Theon's throat, heart pounding, sweat cooling on his brow. A swirl of emotions assaulted him. Rage, betrayal, pity. "Call off your men," he hissed. Theon glared at him through a mask of pain, then whistled. "Stand down," he croaked to those Ironborn who remained. A handful complied. Others tried to flee or were cut down. In moments, the skirmish was over. Another victory for the North, but a bitter one. Jon felt a tremor run through him. He wanted to kill Theon for what he had done, for the innocent lives he'd stolen. But Theon had once shared a roof with him, once laughed at his jokes. Could he simply execute him here in the mud? Wasn't that what Ned Stark would have done to a traitor? Father always said, "He who passes the sentence should swing the sword." But the father who said that was not truly mine, is he? No, Jon corrected himself. Eddard Stark was his father, blood or not. Theon grimaced, arms pinned by men who rushed to restrain him. Blood oozed from his wounded arm. "I would have taken Winterfell if you'd been at the wall," he said, a sneer twisting his lips. Jon's jaw tightened. "You would have found it well defended. You can't hold the whole North snow," Theon spat. "Your precious brother fights in the south. Balon Greyjoy will send more ships. You can't fight them all." Jon let out a long breath, stepping back. "Bind his wounds, then chain him," he ordered. "We'll take him to Winterfell. Let Robb decide his fate." Ser Roderick signaled a pair of men, who hauled Theon up and dragged him aside. Lord Tallheart pressed a hand to Jon's shoulder. "We owe you a debt, Jon. You saved Torren Square. My men and I stand ready to serve House Stark." Jon nodded wearily, exhaustion descending upon him now that the battle was done. The night lay cold and silent, broken by the moans of the injured and dying. Ghost prowled the edges of the torchlight, watchful, red eyes gleaming. When dawn broke, Jon led his men, and their prisoner, back toward Winterfell. Along the way, they helped fortify a few local villages, chasing away any scattered Ironborn. Villagers crowded around Theon, cursing him, some begging to mete out their own justice. But Jon held firm. Traitor though he was, Theon would face justice as the Starks had always done it. The journey back took longer than expected. Snowfall thickened, and the roads were slick. When finally the gray walls of Winterfell rose into view, Jon felt a surge of relief. He was home. The castle gates opened, revealing the courtyard. Bran and Rickon were waiting. Maester Luwin hovered nearby, and the guards who had stayed behind rushed to take in the returning men. They were battered, many wounded, but victorious. Theon stumbled forward under guard, wrists manacled, face pale with pain. Jon could see the flicker of fear in Theon's eyes as he took in the looming fortress that had once sheltered him. Bran wheeled forward, mouth set in a tight line. "Theon," he said, voice full of a child's confusion and anger. "Why?" Theon avoided the boy's gaze, saying nothing. Rickon shrank back, clutching Shaggydog's fur. The direwolf growled. Jon dismounted, inhaling the familiar sense of pine and smoke, and addressed the courtyard in a loud voice. "We have driven the Ironborn back from Torren Square. Theon Greyjoy is our prisoner. He will be held to account for his crimes against the North." A few of the men cheered, though it was subdued. Too many were injured, too many dead. Ser Rodrik turned to Jon. "Well done, my lord. Winterfell stands, and Torren Square is safe. For now." "My lord." Jon heard the honorific again, weighed its meaning. He had not asked for it, but he had earned it through blood and sweat. He felt an ache in his chest, recalling Ned Stark's quiet advice. A lord's responsibilities are more than titles. They are burdens. Jon felt every ounce of that burden as he looked over the weary men, the frightened children, the wounded prisoner. His gaze settled on Theon, and for a brief moment, he remembered the brash, laughing youth who had taught him how to make the perfect shot with a bow. That memory was a faint echo now, overshadowed by betrayal. Jon gave a short, curt order, voice hollow with finality. "Put him in the darkest cell." That night, after seeing to the wounded and checking on Bran and Rickon, Jon found himself alone on the battlements with Ghost. The direwolf's fur blended with the snow that drifted in light flurries around them. Jon rested his arms on the cold stone, looking out over the winter-stricken land. The war was no nearer an end, and yet he had defended the North, if only in this small corner. He was no king, no rightful Stark, but he was not a boy anymore. Far below in the yard, men hauled up repairs for the battered gates, hammered at broken timbers, and prepared for whatever new threat might loom on the horizon. Snow fell in a slow, drifting hush, and Jon let the silence enfold him, feeling the old gods in the wind. "What if I fail?" he thought, but the doubt did not cripple him as before. He had to keep going, for Bran, for Rickon, for the entire North. Somewhere, Ned Stark's spirit watched, and Jon hoped he would be proud. He set his jaw and turned from the wall, heading down to plan the next move. Ghost padded after him, silent as a ghost indeed. Jon might have no rightful claim, but in his heart he was a Stark, and for as long as the gods allowed, Winterfell would remain under his protection. Jon lingered on the battlements long after the last echoes of hammer and saw had died away. Beyond the walls, the moonlit snow stretched silver and quiet. Wisps of wind stirred it here and there, layering the courtyard with a fresh dusting that glimmered under the moon. The victory at Torren Square, though minor in the face of a greater war, now felt like a distant echo. In its wake, the castle buzzed with rumors about Theon Greyjoy's betrayal, about what else might come next, and whether Winterfell would truly remain safe if more Ironborn attempted the same. He had ordered Theon thrown into the darkest cell below the Great Keep, far from any comfort. Yet even that measure did not ease Jon. As turmoil, Theon had once been so close, an arrogant companion, yes, but familiar, almost family. To see him now, bristling with hate and contempt, was a wound Jon had not anticipated. He feared what that might mean for the rest of the North, for it was not only Theon who turned cloak in these desperate times. Alliances frayed everywhere. Danger pressed in on all sides. Jon forced himself from the wall at last and descended the winding stone steps. Ghost padded alongside him in silent vigil, red eyes glowing in the dim torchlight. Jon could almost feel the wolf's breath on the back of his neck, as if Ghost too sensed the unease that clung to the shadows. He passed along the covered walkway and entered the great hall, where a modest fire crackled in the central hearth. Servants bustled about, cleaning up after a late evening meal. A group of men-at-arms were finishing cups of mulled wine, still wearing their cloaks dusted with snow. Their gazes flickered to Jon. Some nodded with respect, others quickly looked away, uncertain how to address the man they had known as the bastard of Winterfell. A lord in all but name now. Jon gave them a polite incline of his head and continued on, ignoring the flicker of self-consciousness that never quite left him. Maester Luwin was waiting near the dais, half buried in scrolls and notes. A single candle burned beside him, lighting his face with a warm glow that did nothing to hide the deep lines of worry. He peered up from his reading as Jon approached. "My lord," the maester said in his soft-spoken way, "I had not expected you at this hour." Jon settled across from him. "I needed to think. How fares the garrison?" "The wounded. Stable for the most part. Torren Square lost more men than we did. But we must not forget that the Ironborn did damage before you arrived. Our own casualties number close to a score with several more wounded. You did well, Jon. But these are heavy losses for a castle so lightly manned." Jon sighed. "I know. Ser Rodrik is still dividing the men between our perimeter patrols and the roads north of the White Knife. We've set watchers near the marshes south of the castle, too, though we can hardly cover everything." Luwin dipped his chin. "I've sent ravens to Robb with updates, of course, but we've not yet received a reply. He must be in the midst of new battles." The maester's hand shook slightly as he lifted a parchment. "In the meantime, word spreads that Theon Greyjoy is your prisoner. The lords near the coast will draw hope from that, though the Greyjoy threat is far from ended." Jon felt a stab of anger at the mention of Theon's name. "I can't comprehend how he could do this. He lived here for years, shared meals with us, trained with us." "Men choose strange roads in times of war," Luwin murmured. "He was a hostage, yes, but also a ward and a friend in his way. Perhaps that duality always haunted him." Jon shook off the surge of bitterness. "What do you advise we do with him now? Even if Robb returns and decides his fate, that could be months. Until then, he sits in our cells, a threat or a potential bargaining chip. If the Ironborn come in larger numbers, I don't want Winterfell to become a target simply to free him." Luwin pursed his lips. "We cannot release him. That much is plain. He would only return to his father's side. As for killing him outright, that is an irrevocable step, one that might only provoke the Ironborn further. Lord Stark would have counseled justice with caution." Jon gazed into the dancing flames in the hearth. "Then we keep him locked away, fed, but not comfortably. Let him reflect on the price of treachery." A quiet moment passed. Outside, a gust of wind battered the walls, rattling shutters and moaning through the cracks. Ghosts sniffed the air. Jon thought of the crypts beneath the castle, his father's tomb still empty. It felt wrong, as though Ned Stark could not find rest even in death. "Maester," Jon asked softly, "have we any word from King's Landing about father's bones? I know we sent a request." Luwin's face clouded. "No word of that either. If they've even allowed them to be shipped north, it might take time. Or worse, they may have refused the request. The Lannisters hold sway in King's Landing now, with Lord Tywin as hand." Jon set his jaw. He said nothing more, but the anger that had flared for Theon now sparked anew for those who had taken Ned Stark's life. Someday justice would be done. But for now, Winterfell needed him, and that duty outweighed any personal vengeance he might crave. He rose from the bench. "I'll check on Bran and Rickon," he said. Luwin nodded, and Jon walked away, Ghost padding at his heels. The corridors were dim this late, but Jon knew them by heart. He passed the library tower, the silent gloom broken only by the occasional squeak of a mouse or the flutter of old parchment. A pair of guards stood outside the door to the tower, and they straightened when Jon approached. They wore the direwolf sigil on their breasts, newly issued tabards for the defenders of Winterfell. They recognized him, bowed their heads in a sign of respect, and let him pass without question. Bran's chamber was warm, thanks to the brazier lit in the corner. The boy lay in bed, half propped up by furs and pillows, while Rickon curled beside him, asleep, his small body tucked against Bran's side. Summer and Shaggy Dog, equally protective, dozed at the foot of the bed. Summer lifted his head at Jon's quiet entrance, yawned, and laid it back down. Bran blinked drowsily. His hair was still the light brown of a child, but shadows under his eyes spoke of troubled dreams. "Jon," he whispered, "is it morning?" "Not yet," Jon said gently. He moved to Bran's bedside. "I just wanted to see if you needed anything." Bran shook his head, stirring the pillow. "I'm all right." Then, voice barely above a whisper, he asked, "Was it truly Theon who attacked Torren Square?" Jon paused, mindful of Rickon's slumber. "Yes," he said at last, keeping his voice low. "He betrayed us. He's in the dungeons now. He won't hurt anyone else." A flicker of sorrow crossed Bran's face. "I thought he was our friend." "So did I." Bran exhaled shakily, eyes dropping. "I've been dreaming again," he said, and Jon recognized a tremor of fear and wonder in his tone. "The three-eyed crow was calling me from below the ground. I saw Father's face in the crypts, only it wasn't carved stone. He was speaking. I couldn't understand the words." Jon felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air. "It was just a dream," he said, stroking Bran's hair gently. "Try to sleep, Bran. I'll be near." Bran nodded, though he wore a pensive frown as he settled back. Jon stood there a moment longer, watching them both. Rickon shifted in his sleep, burying his face in Bran's side, and Shaggy Dog let out a low huff. Together, the two young Stark boys were all the family Jon had left in Winterfell. He vowed silently that he would protect them, no matter the cost. He departed, stepping lightly so as not to wake them further. Ghost followed, as always, but at the door the direwolf paused and cast a final glance at the sleeping children, ears pricked. Then he turned and padded after Jon, out into the corridor. Jon made for his own quarters, though sleep was the last thing on his mind. His body craved rest, but his thoughts churned. The castle's narrow windows revealed the snow falling gently, like a veil draping the courtyard. It reminded him of the wilderness beyond the wall. Vast, silent, unforgiving. He felt a moment's pang about the night's watch. That life was lost to him now. Would it have been simpler? Perhaps, but he no longer regretted his choice. He refused to abandon Winterfell as so many believed he would, or should. He reached his room in the old part of the keep. The chamber was modest. No lord's chambers for him, despite some urging that he take Ned Stark's old rooms. That space, he felt, was not his to claim. Perhaps when Robb returned, he would want them for himself or for his mother. Jon pulled off his gloves, unbuckled Longclaw, and set it against the wooden table. A small fire flickered in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. His thoughts returned to Theon. Perhaps he should go down and face him, demand answers. Or perhaps it would serve no good. The man he'd known was gone. He might only find bitterness and scorn behind those dungeon bars. Still, he couldn't help wanting to look Theon in the eye and ask, "Why?" Jon sank onto his bed, boots still on, and pressed his fingers to his temples. The air smelled faintly of tallow and cold stone. Ghost settled by the door, muzzle on his paws, watching Jon with those unwavering red eyes. In the hush, Jon recalled a time Theon had joked about reaving the seas with his father Balon, back when they were no older than Bran was now. They'd both laughed, for Theon had always been half serious, half not. Now, that boyish bravado had become something else entirely. Actual raiding, actual bloodshed. He shut his eyes and tried not to see the carnage Theon's men had inflicted on the coastline. Instead, he forced himself to breathe slowly, letting exhaustion drag him down into a dark, dreamless sleep. When morning came, Jon was already awake. He washed quickly, donned plain breeches and a dark wool tunic embroidered with the Stark direwolf, then made his way to the great hall. Servants had set out bread, porridge, and bacon for breakfast. A dozen men-at-arms broke their fast. Weary faces turned hopeful when Jon approached. He offered them a smile in greeting. Some of these men had fought beside him at Torren Square. Others had remained to guard Winterfell. Already, it was beginning to feel like a small army of loyalists forming around him, something that both reassured and unsettled him. He was no true Stark, and yet he led them. For now, it had to be so. He ate quickly, then met with Ser Rodrik in the yard. The old knight sported a fresh bandage on his left forearm, courtesy of a slash from an Ironborn raider. Still, he stood tall, mustache bristling, issuing instructions to the handful of archers now practicing near the outer wall. "My lord," Ser Rodrik said, turning as Jon approached, "I was just drilling the new recruits. We have some small folk from nearby villages who volunteered to help defend Winterfell, though their skill is questionable." He gestured toward a cluster of men with mismatched bows, releasing arrows in ragged volleys at straw targets. Most shots went wide. Jon nodded. "We need every arrow, every sword we can muster. The Ironborn could be planning another strike, or the Lannisters might think to send men north. We can't pretend we're safe here." The knight's expression was grim. "There's another matter. We have a small delegation from House Manderly just arrived this morning. They seek audience with you." Jon felt a spark of relief. The Manderlys were among the strongest houses in the north, wealthy and well-connected, even if White Harbor was distant. Perhaps they could offer more men or supplies. "Are they in the hall?" "Yes, my lord," Ser Rodrik confirmed. "Shall I escort you?" Jon glanced around the yard, checking that all was in order, then nodded. "Very well. Let us see what news they bring." They walked together to the great hall, where, by the dais, 3 men bearing the sigil of House Manderly, a white merman on a blue-green field, stood waiting. The eldest among them bowed as Jon approached. He wore an elegant doublet trimmed with fur, and a thick white beard covered most of his lower face. His eyes were shrewd, taking in Jon's presence with keen interest. "My Lord Snow," the man said, pronouncing the title delicately, as though uncertain which honorific best fit. "I am Ser Marlon Manderly, kin to Lord Wyman. We have been dispatched from White Harbor to assess how Winterfell stands and to offer what aid we can, in King Robb's name." Jon inclined his head. "Ser Marlon, we welcome you. Your men are well met here." The knight behind Ser Marlon, a younger man with a trim beard and bright eyes, spoke up. "We heard rumors that Theon Greyjoy was captured by your hand. Is it so?" Jon exchanged a glance with Ser Rodrik. Word indeed traveled fast. "Yes, it is true. Theon attacked Torren Square, but we defeated him and his raiders. He's in our cells." Some of the Manderly men whispered among themselves. Ser Marlon allowed a small smile. "That is good tidings indeed. The Ironborn have harried us along the eastern coasts, though White Harbor remains well fortified. Our Lord Wyman has many watchers along the sea, but these are uncertain times. We do not forget that you have done us service by capturing a key adversary." Jon tried not to show his relief too plainly. "Winterfell stands," he said simply, "but we can always use more men. Our garrison is still depleted, as so many followed Robb south. We have brought a contingent of 50 knights and men-at-arms with us," Ser Marlon said. "Not a great number, but enough to bolster your patrols. Lord Wyman regrets he cannot spare more until we know the Lannisters pose no threat to White Harbor by sea." Jon nodded. "I thank you for that contingent, Ser Marlon. Let me assure you, they are most welcome." He gestured to the side, motioning for a nearby steward. "See that these men are fed and given lodging in the outer towers. Winterfell is cramped these days, but we'll find them proper quarters." Ser Marlon bowed once more. "I shall tell Lord Wyman you received us warmly." Jon could sense the cautious respect in the man's tone. He wondered how news of Jon Snow's stewardship had been greeted in White Harbor. Did they scoff at the notion of a bastard ruling in Ned Stark's seat? Or did they see only a dire need for leadership, no matter whose bloodline led? Either way, the Manderlys had come, and that alone was a significant gesture of support. When the introductions and courtesies were complete, Ser Rodrik led the Manderly men away to arrange their accommodations. Jon lingered near the dais for a moment, gaze sweeping the half-empty hall. A memory rose. Ned Stark seated in the Lord's chair, with Robb at his side, hearing the petty concerns of farmers and small folk. Jon had stood in the corner, wanting to be recognized but never fully included. Now, ironically, the seat of Winterfell stood vacant, and it was Jon who faced those burdens. He roused himself, pushing the bittersweet recollection aside, and retreated to the solar that had once been Ned's. There, he found Maester Luwin sorting through fresh ravens that had just arrived. The old man held a sealed parchment with trembling hands. The wax bore the impression of a crowned direwolf. "A message from Robb," Luwin announced, relief evident in his tone. "It came not long ago." Jon extended his hand, heart hammering a bit. "Let me see." The seal was hastily done, the parchment stained from travel. Jon broke the wax and scanned the letter. Robb's script was tight, rushed. "Jon, I have raised the banners of the Riverlords. They join me willingly, for the Lannisters have wronged them too. I plan to strike again at the forces of Lord Tywin. The Kingslayer remains our prisoner. Mother has gone to treat with Lord Renly, or perhaps Lord Stannis. I am not certain. Our cause is complicated by the fracturing of the Baratheon brothers' alliance. Word reaches me that you hold Theon Greyjoy. Keep him confined. The Ironborn are harrying our shores. I cannot spare men to secure the north for now. You must do what is necessary to maintain our seat. I do not forget what you have done, brother. Father would be proud. Robb Stark, king in the north." Jon exhaled, reading the lines a second time, a swirl of emotions in his chest. Pride, fear, resolve. Robb's letter was brief, but it carried heavy meaning. He was trusting Jon to defend the north in his absence. He was calling him brother. No condemnation for refusing the Night's Watch. No resentment. Just trust and a responsibility that weighed more heavily than any vow of black cloth could have. "Do we have any other ravens from the south?" Jon asked Maester Luwin. "Nothing more recent," the Maester said, though one from Lady Catelyn arrived in Riverrun letters, directed to me, inquiring about Bran and Rickon. "She does not mention you, at least not by name." Luwin hesitated. "It seems she avoids the subject." Jon nodded slowly, swallowing a trace of pain. He knew Lady Catelyn's feelings toward him had always been frosty. In her mind, he was the living proof of Ned Stark's supposed infidelity. Perhaps she still believed he had no right to dwell under this roof, let alone claim guardianship of it. But that was a wound he could not focus on now. "Let us write back to Robb," Jon said, "letting him know Theon is secure and that we have Manderly men here. Assure him that Winterfell stands ready, though we remain wary of the Ironborn. I'll sign it as before." Luwin dipped his head. "I shall do so at once." Jon left him to it. He stepped into the corridor, again feeling that hush of cold air. The presence of Winterfell pressed all around him. Carved stone walls, tapestries of old battles, suits of armor standing mute in alcoves. Ghost appeared at the end of the hall, trotting forward, ears perked. Jon couldn't help a small smile. The direwolf was never far, a constant shadow. Ser Rodrik approached at a brisk pace. "My lord, I have news. One of our patrols returned from the Wolfswood. They found traces of a large party passing through. Footprints of men, some horses, but no clear sigils. Could be more Ironborn or outlaws." Jon's mind raced. How large a party? Hard to say. A few dozen, at least. The footprints seemed fresh, perhaps a day old. They were headed toward the Barrowlands, though the men lost the trail where the ground turns rocky. Jon's brows knit. "We can't allow a host of unknown fighters to wander the Wolfswood. We should send men to track them more carefully, though we can't afford to divide our forces too thin. The Ironborn might still be prowling." Ser Rodrik nodded. "I'll dispatch a smaller scouting group with experienced woodsmen. If they find anything amiss, they can send a raven back." "Good," Jon said. He paused, considering. "If it comes to a fight, though, I don't want them to engage unless they're certain of victory. We can't afford to lose more men." Ser Rodrik gave a stiff bow. "As you say, my lord. I'll see it done." Jon watched him go, noticing how the old knight's steps were not quite as steady as they once had been. The War of the Five Kings, they were calling it, but to Jon it felt like a single war of endless confusion. Alliances shifting like sand, enemies creeping in from the corners. The victory over Theon's raiders had been sweet but small. The realm was in chaos, and the north was too large to protect fully. He thought again of the wall, the wildlings, the rumors of dark shapes in the far north. That too was a threat, but with so many men gone south, who remained to guard against the old powers awakening beyond the wall. Stop it, he told himself. Focus on the immediate threat. Winter is coming. We do what we must day by day. A faint growling from his stomach reminded him he'd hardly eaten. Steeling himself, he headed back to the hall for a quick meal, only to be intercepted by one of the stewards, a lanky youth with wide eyes and a stammer. "My lord, he demands to see you," the lad managed. Jon frowned. "Who demands?" "The prisoner," the steward said, swallowing hard. "Theon Greyjoy. He's been shouting, says he'll only speak with you." Jon suppressed a grimace. He'd been half expecting this. "Very well, let him shout. I have no obligation." He's offering information," the steward interjected. "He claims it's important, about the Ironborn." Jon's chest tightened. Theon might indeed have knowledge that could prevent future raids, or he might be lying to manipulate them. Still, he had to at least hear the man's words. "Take me to him." With Ghost at his side, Jon followed the steward through the winding corridors that led beneath the great keep, deeper into the castle's underbelly where the dungeons lay. The air grew colder and damper with each step. Torches sputtered, throwing wavering light across rough stone walls. The guard at the entrance bowed at Jon's approach and unbarred a heavy iron gate. Beyond it, the corridor branched into a series of cells, each with thick iron bars. They passed cells holding a handful of Ironborn reavers captured at Torren Square. They glared through the bars, spitting curses, but none dared speak out when they recognized Jon. He continued on until he reached the last cell, the darkest one, where Theon Greyjoy sat on a pallet of straw, arms shackled in front of him. A single torch flickered on the wall, illuminating Theon's unkempt hair and the scabbed bandage around his injured arm. Jon stopped just outside the bars. Ghost settled near his feet, lips drawn back slightly, though he did not growl. Theon looked up, eyes gleaming in the torchlight. For a moment, neither spoke. Theon's face had thinned from captivity, his cheeks hollow, beard unkempt. Yet his lips curled in what might have been a sneer or a smile. Jon could not be certain. "You came," Theon said in a hoarse voice. "My gracious warden." Jon folded his arms. "You demanded an audience. The steward said you have information." Theon rose slowly, dragging the chain with him. The damp straw rustled under his boots. "I do. You can question whether it's real or not. But if you choose to ignore me, you'll regret it when the Iron Fleet sails up the White Knife." Jon narrowed his eyes. "Speak plainly. Is your father planning a larger invasion?" Theon shrugged one shoulder. The bandage on his arm looked filthy. Balon Greyjoy sees this war in the south as his chance to break free of the Iron Throne's power, once and for all. The time is ripe, but not all Ironborn are loyal to him. Many remember how your father ended the last rebellion. They might not be eager to die, or they might see opportunity in the chaos. "And what of you?" Jon asked coldly. "Do you support your father's invasion? Or is this you trying to save your own skin?" Theon's jaw clenched. I wanted my father to acknowledge me, to treat me like a son again. I thought capturing Winterfell would prove my worth. But you were here and I failed." He let out a humorless laugh. "Is that what you want to hear? That I'm pathetic? That I'd do anything for a father's approval? Even betray those who were once my friends?" Jon said nothing, but he felt the weight of Theon's words. Father's approval. Had Jon himself not once yearned for something similar? No, he told himself there's no comparison. Theon spilled innocent blood, sacked northern lands. "You did not. You said you have information," Jon pressed. "If you're playing a game, Theon, I won't hesitate to have you chained to a post in the courtyard and let the direwolves have at you." Theon's lips quirked in a wry grimace. I believe you would. Fine. Here it is. My uncle Victorian is assembling longships off Pike. Another uncle, Aaron, stirs the Ironborn with talk of the drowned god's favor. They plan raids deeper into the neck, along the Fever River, and possibly even at the White Knife to isolate White Harbor. They want to cut off trade routes, starve the north, keep you too occupied to march south or protect your own coasts. Jon glanced at the guard. And why would you betray them? Theon's eyes flared with anger, or perhaps shame. Because Bolton means to call himself king of the Isles and the North. He promised me Winterfell if I succeeded. I see now how foolish that was. But don't mistake me. I tell you this because I want to survive. I know you plan to keep me locked away until Robb returns. Well, if that's the case, you need every edge you can get. This is the best I can offer. Jon stared at him, measuring the truth. Theon's words had a ring of plausibility. Bolton Greyjoy once declared himself king of the Isles and the North. That rebellion ended in flames and blood, but perhaps he thought to try again now, while the realm was fractured. The Ironborn favored opportunistic strikes. If they seized key waterways, the North could starve come winter. That made sense, alarming sense. How can we verify any of this? Jon demanded. You have ravens. Send them to houses near the White Knife. Ask if Ironborn ships have been sighted. If so, you'll know I speak the truth. He coughed, the sound echoing off the stone. I've told you what I know. If you're wise, you'll prepare. If not, your choice. Jon's mouth twisted. He wanted to lash out, to tell Theon how vile he was for his treachery. But part of him believed. Theon had grown up in Winterfell. He would know the North's vulnerability. This plan reeked of Ironborn cunning. If it proves true, we will prepare, Jon said at last, voice tight. If it's a lie, you'll wish you died at Torren Square. Theon's expression remained bitterly calm. Then at least feed me properly, and bring fresh bandages. My arm is rotting here. I can hardly. Jon turned to the guard. See to it he's not dying of infection. If we're to keep him for trial, he lives. But no comforts, beyond what's necessary. The guard saluted. Theon hissed a breath between his teeth. You always were the honorable sort, just like Ned Stark. But you're not really his. Jon's glare froze the words on Theon's lips. Without another look, Jon pivoted on his heel and strode away, Ghost following. He heard Theon's faint, mocking laugh echo after him, and it took every ounce of restraint not to turn back and strike him. But he forced himself onward, out of the dungeons, into the blessedly colder corridors above. He emerged into the courtyard, where midday sunlight had broken through the clouds, illuminating the frosty ground. Men sparred at training dummies, while others carried timbers for reinforcing the outer gate. The repairs from the earlier attacks were nearly complete, but if Theon spoke truth, it was only a matter of time before more raids came. Jon found Ser Rodrik near the stable, discussing supply arrangements with a stable hand. He pulled the knight aside, voice low. Theon says his uncle's plan to strike further inland, possibly along the White Knife and the Fever River. Ser Rodrik stiffened. That would be bold indeed. Most Ironborn prefer to raid the coasts. They may sense we're stretched thin. If it's true, we need to warn White Harbor. The Manderlys must brace themselves. The old knight nodded gravely. I'll see a raven dispatched immediately. Perhaps we can rally more of their knights to defend those routes. And we can bolster Moat Caelan's defenses if they try to come up through the neck. He paused, adjusting the glove on his bandaged arm. What do we do about Theon? Jon pressed his lips together. He remains in the dungeon. We can't trust him, but we can't kill him outright. If he's lying, we'll know soon enough. If he's telling the truth, we must act. Either way, he stays chained. Agreed, Ser Rodrik said. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'll see to those ravens. Jon watched him depart, feeling the cold wind whip across the courtyard. He glanced at Ghost, who stood alert, nose lifting to the breeze. The direwolf's fur ruffled as if sensing a storm. Jon felt it too, a gathering tension, an unquiet hush that settled over the north like a dark cloud. He walked to the practice yard, where a group of young recruits was training. Their breath fogged in the chill air as they swung wooden swords. One overeager boy with hair the color of rust nearly overbalanced and fell. Jon helped him regain his footing, quietly correcting his stance. The lad mumbled thanks, cheeks red with more than cold. Jon nodded and moved on, patrolling the line, offering pointers he'd gleaned from years under Ser Roderick's instruction. Once, not so long ago, Jon had been the student, a bastard overshadowed by Robb's confident skill in the yard. Now, these men looked to him for leadership and guidance. The swirl of time and fate still baffled him, but he forced himself to focus on each parry, each stance, each detail that might save a life in the next battle. When the training wound down, Jon removed his gloves and found his hands trembling from cold and exertion. He rubbed them together, noticing a faint stain of red from a shallow cut he'd helped demonstrate with a recruit's blade. He turned to Ghost. "Let's walk," he said quietly, and the dire wolf fell into step beside him as he strode toward the godswood. The godswood of Winterfell was a haven of ancient oaks and ironwoods surrounding the heart tree, a great weirwood, its bark white as bone, its leaves a deep crimson. Jon stepped carefully along the snow-laden path. The air was hushed here, the wind stilled by the dense branches overhead. In the quiet, Jon heard the soft crunch of his boots, Ghost's pads on the snow, and nothing else. He approached the heart tree. The red face carved into the trunk seemed to watch him with eternal solemnity. As a child, he'd often come here with Robb and Arya, or to watch Ned Stark clean ice after a beheading or to pray in the old ways. Now Ned was gone and Jon stood in his place, or tried to. He bowed his head, not quite kneeling, but letting the hush envelope him in a sense of timelessness. "Father," he whispered, though he felt foolish addressing the tree. "I hope I'm doing right. I never wanted to claim Winterfell, never wanted to take a lord's role. But I couldn't leave them all unprotected. Theon's betrayal shows what can happen when we turn away for even a moment." The carved red eyes stared back, unblinking. He remembered how Ned Stark would pray here in silence, sometimes for hours. Perhaps he never heard an answer, or perhaps he had in ways Jon couldn't understand. Jon placed a hand on the trunk. The bark felt cold and hard. "Keep them safe," he muttered, voice barely audible. "Bran, Rickon, even me. I'm trying, Father. I swear it. Winter is coming, and I'll stand for House Stark until Robb returns." A faint stirring of wind moved the crimson leaves, making them rustle like distant whispers. Ghost circled around the tree, ears alert, as though sensing something deep in the ancient wood. Jon looked up, scanning the canopy. For a moment, he felt eyes upon him. He turned, half expecting to see someone behind him, but no one was there. A subtle chill prickled his neck. The old gods, or perhaps only the quiet watchfulness of centuries of memory stored in these roots. He stepped back, letting out a slow breath. Enough of mystic pondering. He had real tasks waiting. Summoning his resolve, he exited the godswood, walking in purposeful strides back toward the courtyard. On the way, he nearly collided with Hodder, the gentle giant who served as Bran's carrier and caretaker. Hodder looked flustered, all 7 feet of him stooping to avoid a low lintel. "Hodder," he murmured apologetically, sidestepping Jon. Jon offered him a smile. "It's all right, Hodder. Is Bran with you?" "Hodder," the big man repeated, shaking his head. Then he pointed vaguely back to the keep. Jon interpreted it to mean that Bran was still inside, presumably in his chamber or the Great Hall. "All right," Jon said, patting Hodder's arm. "Thank you." He didn't want to worry the gentle giant with more questions, so he let him pass. Hodder ambled off, muttering to himself. Ghost watched him go, tail flicking. Jon continued on. Inside, the bustle of the castle greeted him. Servants moving about, a few knights from House Manderly conferring with Ser Roderick, stewards delivering messages. Winterfell was alive, bracing for whatever might come. He noted the presence of a handful of older men, likely from the local village, discussing supply lists with the Manderly quartermaster. It comforted Jon to see the North pulling together in some small measure. He entered his solar to find Maester Luwin hunched over his desk, carefully writing a letter. The quill scratched against the parchment, and the old man paused only to dip it in ink or adjust his spectacles. Jon pulled a chair and sat across from him. "Any new tidings?" Luwin set the quill down. "This letter is to Lord Wyman Manderly, informing him of the possible threat Theon spoke of. Raids up the White Knife. Also, I am asking if White Harbor can send us more provisions. We have more mouths to feed now, especially with additional men from the Manderlys themselves." Jon nodded. "Good. Ser Rodrik is sending word to other lords, I trust. Yes, we will alert the Tallhearts, the Serwins, the Glovers, all who remain in the north. Many are already depleted, as you know, but at least we can put them on guard." Jon let his gaze wander around the solar old maps, dusty tomes, a sword rack that still held practice blades. The responsibilities weighed on him heavier each day. "I'll send out more patrols," he said. "Even though we risk thinning ourselves. If the Ironborn are massing, we need early warning." "Agreed," Luwin said softly. "But do not overstretch. Winter is setting in, and you'll need supplies if your men travel far." Jon considered the approach of winter. The air had turned sharper day by day. Snow flurries drifted into the yard more often. The storerooms under Winterfell were decent, but if the war dragged on, if trade routes were cut, they could face shortages. "We should see about preserving more food," Jon mused. "Salting meats, drying fish, storing grains. The idea of scarcities." "Already in progress," Luwin said with a small smile. "You've done your father proud, Jon." He always tended to such duties meticulously, ensuring Winterfell could outlast the longest winter if needed. Jon swallowed at the mention of Ned Stark. "I hope I do half as well," he murmured. "The more I learn, the more I realize how much he carried on his shoulders." They shared a brief silence. Then Luwin returned to his letter, and Jon left him to it. He wandered the corridors, greeting men, listening to concerns. By the time evening fell, the day had passed in a flurry of tasks and minor crises. A stable roof that needed patching, a dispute among some villagers over grazing rights, a tension between newly arrived Manderly men and local guards over who outranked whom. Jon dealt with each as best he could, feeling the swirl of exhaustion tighten around him. At last, after a supper of roast venison, Jon excused himself. He climbed the winding steps to the top of the first keep, a tall tower seldom used. There, beneath the open sky, he gazed over the snowy roofs and ramparts of Winterfell. Pale moonlight lit the outlines of towers, the library, the great hall. Smoke rose from chimneys in delicate plumes. The far side of the castle boasted the glass gardens, their structure faintly visible through the gloom. It was peaceful from this vantage, yet he knew a single misstep could bring the Ironborn surging back. Or a Lannister host or some other threat. War had come to the land, and no place was truly safe. Yet, in that quiet moment, he let himself take a slow breath, inhaling the crisp air that smelled of pine and snow. Ghost stood beside him, nose lifted, ears alert. "Do you sense anything, boy?" Jon asked softly. Ghost let out a low rumble deep in his throat, as if uncertain. Jon reached down to scratch behind the wolf's ear. Night fell deeper. Stars emerged overhead, glittering like shards of ice. The bitter wind nipped at Jon's cheeks. He drew his cloak around him tighter, but stayed a while longer, as though the wind and the cold might steel him for what lay ahead. He thought of the stories old Nen used to tell about the long night when the others came and waged war against the living. He thought of wildlings beyond the wall, an entire realm dealing with winter's harshness. And here he stood, not a sworn brother in black, but a lord steward, or perhaps a lord himself in all but name. The dissonance still haunted him. He closed his eyes, letting the cold sharpen his mind. The old gods, the ancient watchers in the heart trees, the spirits of the north, whatever they were, they bound him here to Winterfell with a bond stronger than any black oath could have forged. A shrill cry interrupted his reverie, the sound of a raven's call. Jon opened his eyes, scanning the darkness. One of the castle ravens must have slipped from the rookery, or perhaps was perched somewhere near. The bird's cry sounded restless, echoing off stone. Jon sighed, turned, and descended the steps. Enough brooding. In the morning, he would see to Theon's claims about the Ironborn. He would plan more scouting missions, strengthen relations with their allies, keep sending updates to Robb. The North's survival depended on vigilance. He would not fail. He was nearly to his chamber when he heard a soft knock behind him. Turning, he saw Osha, the wildling woman who had helped care for Bran. She stood in the corridor, arms folded, her eyes as sharp as ever. "You're the new caretaker of this castle, are you?" she asked with a wry tilt of her head. "Bastard or not, you wear the wolf's skin here." Jon blinked, surprised by her directness. "I suppose I do. Is there something you need?" She shook her head. "Only to tell you that the wildlings are stirring beyond the wall. I've heard it in the wind. You might not care for that all the way down here, but mark my words. Something's coming from the far north. Something worse than these squabbles of kings." Jon remembered the last time Osha had spoken so. She had fled south of the wall to escape whatever nightmares lurked in the frostbitten forest. "I believe you," he said quietly, "but I can't do much about it. My place is here." She shrugged, as though neither satisfied nor disappointed by his answer. "Just remember that the real war might not be men against men. You've got a big, strong wolf, but sometimes claws and teeth ain't enough." Jon nodded. "I'll remember." Osha left, her footsteps echoing lightly down the hall. Jon stood there a moment longer, letting her words sink in. She spoke of the old terrors, the White Walkers. He had overheard hints from old Nan's stories, from rumors at the wall. But it all seemed distant compared to the Ironborn threat, the Lannisters, the pressing concerns of daily survival in a war-torn realm. Yet a chill in his blood told him that Osha might be right. There were forces moving in the dark that few in the Seven Kingdoms recognized. He finally returned to his chamber, sank onto the bed, and stared at the flickering fire. His mind swirled with Theon, the Ironborn, Robb's war, Lady Catelyn's disapproval, the danger from beyond the wall. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes, wanting a moment's peace. Ghost lay down with a soft huff, resting his muzzle on his paws. At length, exhaustion overcame Jon's restless thoughts. He lay back and drifted into uneasy sleep, dreams filled with shifting images. He saw a gray direwolf at the head of an army, Robb's eyes burning bright. He saw the sea rising, black waves crashing against the walls of Winterfell. A horn echoed in the darkness. Then, amid swirling snow, he glimpsed a figure with glowing blue eyes, a chill radiating from its pale skin. The wind howled, voices cried out. Jon tried to move, but the snow dragged at him like living Han. "Dies." He startled awake, heart pounding. The chamber's fire had burned low, leaving coals that glowed faintly in the hearth. A sheen of sweat covered his brow, though the room was cold. Ghost was up, ears pricked, staring at Jon as though sensing his distress. Jon caught his breath, swallowing the taste of fear. "Only a dream," he murmured, though it had felt painfully real. He rubbed his arms to chase away the lingering chill, then rose to add a log to the fire. The dryness in his throat made him crave water, so he stepped to a small pitcher on the table, poured a cup, and drank. Outside, the night was still. Nothing but the silent hush of winter creeping ever closer. The next few days passed in a steady rhythm of work and vigilance. Messages came and went by Raven, with confirmations that indeed some Ironborn ships had been spotted far off the coast, near the Bight, suggesting Theon's warning had truth. House Manderly promised to increase their patrols. Jon kept the gates of Winterfell guarded, rotating men to ensure fatigue didn't set in. He doubled the watch at night, especially around the moat and the walls. All the while, Theon remained in his cell, sometimes silent, sometimes hurling insults at the guards. Maester Luwin arranged to have his bandage changed, as Jon had ordered, but his accommodations remained squalid. The other Ironborn prisoners were likewise confined, but they lacked Theon's rank and thus drew less attention. Bran, for his part, spent hours poring over old maps and genealogies in the library, as if searching for something. Rickon wandered the corridors with Shaggy Dog in tow, still jumpy whenever strangers passed. Each day, Jon made time to visit them, to reassure them Winterfell was safe. Rickon seemed unconvinced, always looking over his shoulder for threats. Bran, on the other hand, asked Jon pointed questions about the crypts and the kings of winter who lay interred there, about the old days when the Starks were kings in the north. Jon answered as best he could, but often he found himself at a loss. One afternoon, while Jon was coordinating a routine patrol with Ser Rodrik and the Manderly men, a horn blast shattered the calm. A single note, urgent, from the direction of the main gate. Everyone went tense. Jon's hand flew to Longclaw's pommel. "Form up," Ser Rodrik shouted. The courtyard bustled with swift movement. Archers took positions along the battlements, swordsmen readied in the yard. Jon climbed to the gatehouse, heart hammering, to see what approached. To his shock, a small party of riders bearing the Dreadfort sigil, a flayed man, stood outside the gate. The lead rider was a pale man in dark armor, accompanied by a handful of grim-faced soldiers. Jon recognized Roose Bolton's standard immediately and felt a wave of unease. House Bolton was known for its cruelty, though they were supposedly loyal to the Starks. Robb had entrusted them with significant duties in the war, yet Jon had never trusted them fully. He gave the order to open the gate just enough to let them inside, mindful to keep the portcullis half lowered. The riders filed in. Their leader swung off his horse and inclined his head in what might be called respect. "My Lord Snow," he said in a quiet, almost whispery tone. "I am Steelshanks Walton, in service to Lord Bolton. We come bearing tidings for the Warden of the North." Jon's spine stiffened at the man's addressing him as "my lord," but he nodded curtly. "Welcome to Winterfell. Speak your tidings." Steelshanks glanced around, eyes flicking over the walls, the archers above. He did not miss how ready for battle Winterfell looked. A ghost of a smile curled his lips. "You have made the castle quite secure. Lord Bolton will be pleased. He sends word that he has engaged Lannister forces in the west and contributed to Robb Stark's victory at Oxcross. The king in the north wishes Bolton to send men northward, to bolster your defenses against the Ironborn." Jon's heart leapt at the mention of a victory, but he kept his composure. "That is good to hear. We do need men. Robb has not told me of this arrangement, though. The raven from Robb was delivered to us on the march," Steelshanks explained. "We rode directly here at Lord Bolton's command to see how best his men might be employed. Lord Bolton is gathering a contingent to march soon." Jon forced a polite smile. "Then we welcome any loyal forces. We've had trouble along our coasts. Theon Greyjoy's men attacked Torren Square. We captured Theon himself." Steelshanks raised his eyebrows. "Truly? That is quite a prize. Lord Bolton will be most curious to see him." Jon did not like the thinly veiled eagerness in the man's tone. "He remains our prisoner until Robb decides his fate," Jon said firmly. "For now, we have other pressing concerns. Will Lord Bolton come himself?" "Likely not," Steelshanks said. "He is needed in the field, harrying the Lannisters, but he will send his bastard son, Ramsay Snow, to lead the reinforcement." A prickle of unease crossed Jon's skin. Ramsay Snow, the bastard of Bolton, was rumored to be a sadistic figure even among Bolton loyalists. Jon had heard only whispers, stories of Hunt's savage cruelty. Having another bastard in the north might have sparked an odd kinship in theory, but from what Jon knew, Ramsay was nothing like him. He felt a tightening in his gut. Still, they needed men. Could he refuse them? For a moment, Jon weighed the consequences. "Then I suppose we shall receive him," he said slowly, voice guarded. "If he comes under the banner of House Stark, we shall work together to repel the Ironborn. You'll find Winterfell is prepared to stand against any threat." Steelshanks gave a measured nod, his expression unreadable. "Very good, my lord. We will report back to the Dreadfort and deliver your acceptance. Expect our arrival before the next moon's turn." He paused, as though considering whether to add something more. Then, with another curt bow, he remounted his horse, and his men followed suit. The gates opened again, and they rode out, the flayed man banner trailing behind them. Jon stood on the ramparts, watching them disappear into the snowy distance, a knot of anxiety coiling in his stomach. Ser Rodrik came up beside him. "Boltons," he muttered. "They can be valuable allies, and yet, I do not like how they go about their affairs." Jon's jaw tightened. "Nor I, but Robb must have his reasons for granting them a share in the fighting. If they can bring us men to hold off the Ironborn, we can't refuse, not without direct orders from Robb." The old knight nodded, mustache bristling. "Aye, we can't, but keep your eyes open, Jon. The Boltons play cunning games." Jon knew that well enough. He could sense the potential for treachery in the air. But for now, necessity outweighed suspicion. Winterfell stood on precarious ground, and every sword counted. He stepped down from the rampart, checking the position of the sun. Late afternoon. Soon it would be time to oversee the changing of the guard, then join Bran and Rickon for supper. He thought of Ramsay Snow, the bastard of Bolton, soon to arrive with a host of men. Another bastard in Winterfell, one with a well-earned reputation for cruelty. Perhaps it was a chance to show that not all bastards were alike. Or perhaps it was an impending disaster. He inhaled, letting the cold air sting his lungs. One day at a time, he reminded himself. He had chosen this path, chosen to guard Winterfell in Robb's absence. The oncoming storm was inevitable. Another wave of worry heaped upon the rest. But he could not waver. In the distance, a raven cawed. Ghost pressed closer to Jon's side, a comforting presence amid swirling uncertainties. Together, they headed down into the yard. The sun dipped below the towers, casting long shadows. Jon pictured Ned Stark, pictured his calm countenance as he listened to problems from all corners of the north. He would stand steady, unwavering, in the face of anything. "Remember your vows," Father used to say. Though Jon had not sworn the black, he had made a vow to Winterfell in his heart the day he refused Benjen's call. He would not break faith with that vow. Winter was coming, and he would face it head-on, come what may. That night, a windstorm rattled the castle, tearing at the shutters and howling through the courtyards. Snow whipped over the walls, piling in corners and drifting against doorways. Jon spent the evening checking on the stables, ensuring the horses were secure, talking with the stable master about feed stockpiles. He lingered in the great hall, where a group of villagers who had come seeking shelter huddled around the fire, grateful for the warmth of Winterfell. Some had fled raids, others had left their farms out of fear of bandits. Jon walked among them, urging calm, promising that no harm would come to them here. Afterward, he climbed the steps to Bran's room to find the boy awake despite the hour, a thick tome open on his lap. Rickon dozed on a small cot, Shaggy Dog curled at his feet. Summer lay near Bran, watchful, eyes half-lidded. "What are you reading?" Jon asked softly, crossing to the bedside. Bran looked up, blinking. "Legends of the Long Night," he replied, tapping the page. "Maester Luwin said we have to be ready for winter, but this winter. Some say it might be as bad as that ancient time when the others came." Jon felt a stir of unease. "Those are only stories, Bran." Bran's gaze was far away. "So were giants and children of the forest, but old Nan said they're real. We have Osha, too. She's seen things." Jon laid a hand on Bran's shoulder, squeezing gently. "We'll be prepared for anything. Promise. Now you should sleep. Morning will come soon, and we'll be busy again." Bran nodded, though reluctantly. Jon helped him set the book aside, then pulled a fur blanket over him. Rickon shifted in his cot, muttering something incomprehensible. Shaggy Dog's ears flicked up, but he settled again. The low glow of the hearth cast flickering shadows on the walls, shaping themselves into forms that Jon tried not to interpret. He gave Bran a final reassuring pat, then left. In the corridor, Osha leaned against a wall, arms crossed. She gave him a sidelong look. "The boy's reading about the others, eh?" Jon nodded, not surprised she'd overheard. "He's curious. He'd best be." Curiosity might save his life if they come again. Jon had no reply to that, so he moved on. Ghost trailed behind, pausing only to sniff at a corner before continuing on. They passed Hodder, who smiled broadly and said, "Hodder!" before disappearing into a side room. Finally, Jon reached his chamber and entered, weary from the day's demands and the unsettled night. Outside, the storm still raged, howling like an angry beast. He sat on the edge of his bed, unbuckling Longclaw from his belt, setting it within easy reach. As he leaned back, closing his eyes, he could not help but see the image of Ramsay Snow's Flayedman banner on the horizon. Theon Greyjoy stewing in his cell, the Ironborn ships gathering at sea, and somewhere far south, Robb Stark fighting a war. He rubbed a hand over his eyes, breathing deeply. The responsibilities were crushing at times, yet he could not shrink from them. If Ned Stark had taught him anything, it was that a leader must bear the burden for those who cannot. Even a bastard can step into that role if no one else remains. He drifted into an uneasy slumber, dreams filled with swirling snow, the echo of horns, the shifting faces of men who might be friend or foe. Thunder crashed in his mind, or perhaps it was the clatter of swords. He saw a castle gate open to reveal a dark figure riding a pale horse. Ice crackled underfoot. Then he felt a searing cold, as if a hand of frost clutched his heart. He awoke with a gasp, heart hammering. Outside, the wind had died to a low moan. Early dawn light seeped through the shutters, revealing a pall of gray. Another day in the north, another day to stand firm. Jon forced himself up, ignoring the lingering dread of his dreams. Soon enough, word arrived from the gate. A rider approached in House Bolton livery. Not the full host, but a messenger. Jon washed quickly and dressed, strapping on his sword belt out of habit. Ghost followed him to the courtyard, where a small crowd had gathered. The messenger reined in a lathered horse, dismounted, and bowed. The man looked anxious, cheeks windburned. "My Lord Snow," he said, breathing heavily. "We ride from the Dreadfort. Lord Bolton has dispatched his son with 200 men. They'll be here within a day or two, if the weather holds." Jon looked past the man, as though trying to see the road beyond the gates. "So soon. Very well. Winterfell will prepare to receive them." The messenger nodded, then tugged his horse aside, likely to find food and rest. Jon stood in place, letting out a slow breath. 200 men were enough to make a difference in defending Winterfell from any renewed Ironborn incursion. Yet it also gave the Boltons a sizable presence within these walls. Would that presence be truly loyal, or would it bring new dangers? He glanced at Ser Rodrik, who stood at his shoulder. The knight returned a grave nod, understanding the silent question. "We'll house them, feed them," Jon said quietly. "But we keep watch. No matter what, we keep watch." Ser Rodrik's mustache twitched. "Aye, my lord, and I'll see to it that the men remain vigilant, especially around Theon's cell. We can't risk any clandestine deals with Bolton's lot." Jon agreed. "Good. If Theon tries to wriggle free by making promises to the Boltons, we'll put an end to it." He turned to the Manderly knight who had come with Ser Marlin. "Alert your men as well. We expect Bolton reinforcements, but if anything seems amiss, you let me or Ser Rodrik know immediately." The knight bowed. "Of course." Jon scanned the courtyard, which was bustling with activity as the news spread. Some were relieved at the prospect of more soldiers. Others looked apprehensive. The mere name of Bolton could send a chill through those who remembered rumors of flaying and cruelty in the days of old. Jon squared his shoulders, forcing calm into his voice as he called out commands to ensure the gates and accommodations were readied. A short time later, as Jon made his way to the hall, he crossed paths with Hodder, Bran, and Osha. Bran was in the basket harness that Hodder used to carry him up and down stairs, and Osha walked beside them. Bran's wide eyes lifted to Jon. "What's happening?" Jon tried to keep his tone light. "We're to have guests. The Boltons are sending men." Bran's brow furrowed. "Are they friendly?" Jon hesitated, then forced a small nod. "They're allies of House Stark, so they should be. We'll be cautious, though." Bran pressed his lips together, clearly sensing the unspoken tension. "If they do anything bad," Osha snorted, "then we'll crack their skulls." "Hotter," Hodder muttered, as if in agreement. Jon offered a faint smile. "I pray it doesn't come to that. Don't worry. I'll keep you safe, Bran." He touched Bran's shoulder, and the boy looked up at him, trust and lingering fear mingling in his gaze. Then Hodder continued onward, carefully maneuvering the corridor, humming quietly to himself as they went. Osha shot Jon a final glance and followed, her expression guarded. Jon watched them go. Once, all Bran had worried about was climbing towers. Now he lived in a world of war and uncertainty. A swirl of pity and protectiveness stirred in Jon's chest. He forced himself onward, heading to the Great Hall for yet another day of decisions, readiness, and waiting for the arrival of men who could be friend or foe. By midday, the sun broke through the clouds, giving the world a brief respite from winter's gray gloom. Snow glimmered on the rooftops and walls. A crisp breeze rustled the banners. Jon took the chance to walk the perimeter of Winterfell's walls, accompanied by a pair of guards and Ghost. From high above, the realm looked serene, the forest stretching out in a white blanket. The farmland around the castle was bare and cold, fields lying dormant until spring. Smoke from distant cottages traced thin lines into the sky. As he made a final circuit, he heard the horn from the main gate. A distant column appeared on the road, banners of the flayed man shifting in the breeze. The bastard of Bolton had arrived. Jon descended, heart tight, and positioned himself in the courtyard with Ser Rodrik at his side. The main gate creaked open. In rode a line of mounted men, around 200 strong as promised. Some wore heavy cloaks lined with fur, others had battered armor showing the scars of battle. In the midst of them, astride a black stallion, was Ramsay Snow. He was a stocky young man with pale skin and dark hair, his eyes glittering with a hungry sort of malice even when he smiled. His cloak bore the flayed man's sigil, though as a bastard, he was not entitled to display it the same way his father could. Jon felt a chill at the man's outward geniality. "Greetings," Ramsay said, dismounting. He surveyed Jon with a slow once-over, then turned to Ser Rodrik. "I bring my father's compliments to the rightful guardians of the North." Jon stepped forward, meeting Ramsay's gaze. "We welcome you, Ramsay Snow, on behalf of King Robb Stark and House Stark of Winterfell." Ramsay's lips curved in a thin smile. "Well said, my Lord Snow. 2 bastards protecting Winterfell." He chuckled softly, though there was no warmth in the sound. "We shall have much to discuss, you and I." Jon didn't smile. "We appreciate your men," he said formally. "We are pressed by the Ironborn, and House Stark welcomes any aid from its loyal bannermen." Ramsay nodded. "Of course, we are loyal." His gaze drifted briefly across the courtyard, where some villagers looked on. Then it flicked back to Jon. "Might we see to stabling our horses and quartering the men? We've ridden long." "Certainly." Jon gestured to a steward. "We've prepared rooms in the outer keep. Your men can stable their horses near the eastern wall. Our steward will guide you. We'll speak in the Great Hall once you're settled." Ramsay made a graceful bow, though something in his eyes still unnerved Jon. "Thank you, my lord. We shall do so." He turned, barking commands to his men. They moved with practiced efficiency, forming lines, proceeding to unload supplies. Ramsay cast a final glance at Jon before following them, leading his black stallion by the reins. Ghost let out a low growl that only Jon seemed to hear. Ser Rodrik muttered under his breath, "Nasty piece of work." Jon nodded in silent agreement. "We'll keep them on a short leash." The next few hours were a flurry of activity as the new arrivals took up their assigned quarters. Jon assigned extra guards to watch over Theon's cell, wary that Ramsay might see Theon as a valuable piece for his own schemes, or worse, might attempt some private revenge. The Boltons had fought the Greyjoys in the earlier rebellion, and the thought of Theon under Ramsay's power made Jon uneasy. Late in the day, Ramsay and a handful of his officers joined Jon, Ser Rodrik, and Maester Luwin in the Great Hall. A modest feast had been prepared to welcome them. A spread of roast pig, stewed turnips, fresh bread, and ale. The hall was not nearly as full as in Ned Stark's time, but it bustled with a subdued energy. Ramsay took a seat near Jon, smiling in a way that reminded Jon uncomfortably of Theon's old cocky grin, only darker. As servants poured ale, Ramsay lifted his cup. "To the king in the north," he said, though the toast sounded almost mocking. Jon forced a nod. "To Robb Stark." They drank, and conversation turned to war. Ramsay boasted of how his father had tricked some of Tywin Lannister's outriders, luring them into a trap. He spoke of flanking maneuvers, cunning strategies, and the potential for more ambushes. Jon listened politely, though he mistrusted the glee in Ramsay's tone whenever he described the fate of captured foes. Eventually, the topic shifted to the Ironborn, and Ramsay's dark eyes fixed on Jon. "I hear you took Theon Greyjoy prisoner. How impressive, my Lord Snow." Jon's jaw tightened. "He attacked Torren Square. We drove him off and took him captive. He remains locked in our dungeon." Ramsay looked almost delighted. "May I see him? My father would certainly want me to confirm his capture." Jon paused. "He's not in a presentable state," he said carefully. "We keep him for Robb's justice. If you wish to confirm it, I'll have Ser Rodrik accompany you." He did not want Ramsay alone with Theon, suspecting it might end badly for Theon and complicate matters for Robb. Ramsay shrugged. "As you wish, Lord Snow. I'm sure Theon is quite miserable down there. Perhaps I can make him more miserable." His grin revealed the edge of cruelty that had given Ramsay his foul reputation. Jon set down his cup, meeting Ramsay's gaze with cold resolve. "He's our prisoner, not yours. You'll do nothing without my leave. I trust that is clear." A tense silence settled over the table. Ramsay's officers glanced at their lord's bastard, as if wondering how he would react. But Ramsay, after a heartbeat, raised his hands in a mock gesture of surrender. "Of course, I would never overstep your authority within these walls. Forgive me if I seemed eager." Jon nodded curtly, though he did not ease his posture. The tension at the table lingered like a phantom. Maester Luwin cleared his throat and changed the subject, speaking of supply routes, the threat of further raids. Ramsay contributed politely, discussing possible strategies to root out Ironborn holdouts. Yet Jon could never quite shake the sense that a viper coiled behind Ramsay's eyes. After the feast wound down, men drifted off to their duties or to find rest. Ramsay took his leave with a graceful bow, heading toward the guest quarters with a handful of his men, doubtless to unpack or plan whatever he planned. Jon watched them go, unsettled. Ser Rodrik came to his side, expression grim. "He wants Theon. You can see it in his face," the old knight said quietly. Jon nodded. "We'll keep Theon heavily guarded. I'll speak with the men personally. Ramsay so much as looks at that cell door without my consent, they bar his way." Ser Rodrik put a hand on Jon's shoulder, a fatherly gesture. "You do well, Jon. Ned Stark would be proud of how you've held this castle together." Hearing that eased some of Jon's tension. "Thank you, Ser Rodrik. We'll endure. For Robb, for Ned Stark, for the North." The old knight nodded, then departed to attend to the final details of the evening. Jon stepped outside into the snowy courtyard, inhaling the cold air. The moon overhead was nearly full, shining with a pale light that turned the drifts to silver. Winterfell's walls stood resolute, a bastion in the swirling chaos of the realm. Yet inside these walls, new perils lurked, iron and flayed men alike. Jon rubbed his neck, feeling the weight of leadership press deeper into his bones. Ghost emerged from the shadows, padding up to Jon. The direwolf nuzzled Jon's hand, and Jon stroked Ghost's head, grateful for the silent companionship. Overhead, the winter sky was vast and unfeeling. Jon felt small beneath it, but also determined. He gazed at the distant horizon beyond the walls, picturing the white knife, the Ironborn reavers, the uncertain alliances. And he thought of Osha's warning, that something ancient and deadly might stir beyond the wall. Theon's betrayal, Ramsay's malice. Perhaps these were but lesser evils compared to what lay in the far north. Still, it was all he could do to keep Winterfell secure. Robb fought in the south, and Jon was here, the watchers on the walls, the dire wolf in the yard, the battered but unbroken heart of the north. He would endure. He would uphold the name of Stark until Robb returned. No matter how dark the nights or how deep the snow, that vow would guide him. For Ned Stark's memory, for the brothers he had grown up alongside, for the northern folk who looked to him as their shield. The wind whispered across the courtyard, and he imagined, in that fleeting moment, it carried his father's voice, urging him onward. Winter is coming, and Jon Snow was ready to face it. He turned, cloak swirling, and walked back into the keep with Ghost. The door closed behind them, and the moonlight fell upon the courtyard, silent and cold, as Winterfell's new bastion of defenders prepared for the trials yet to come.